Hello and welcome to the View from Mayor Brown podcast. This is a combined episode including the fortnightly podcast series for employment lawyers and HR practitioners and our pension series aimed at those working in the pensions industry. The presenters are Nicholas Robertson and Beth Brown. The time spent listening to these podcasts can count towards your continuing education requirements. And at the end of the podcast, we will explain how to get in touch if you wish to claim credit for continuing education purposes or if you have any comments or questions.
Hello and welcome to a special joint podcast. My name is Nicholas Robertson. I'm head of the London Employment Team and one of the firm's global leaders for the Employment and Benefits Group. And as far as I'm concerned, this is podcast number 165 in the ongoing employment podcast series. However, I am joined by
Beth Brown, and I am a counsel in the London Pensions Group. And on the pension side, this is the 8th episode. We're a bit behind Nick.
You'll catch me up. You'll catch me up. Trust me. So the background to this is that Beth and I both work in the Employment and Benefits Group. And Beth has picked up the reins on the pensions podcast. I've been doing an employment podcast for many years now. And we thought it'd be a really good idea to talk about things coming up in 2020 from the employment side that might be of interest on the pension side, and from the pension side that might be of interest on the employment side. So we've each picked a few items to talk about, and Beth, why don't you kick off? Why don't you start?
So what I'm going to talk to you first of all, in the pensions world, 2020 is going to be focusing on improving member engagement, which is obviously relevant to all your employees. In November 2019, the Department for Work and Pensions published a consultation paper around simplification of annual benefit statements. The consultation closed in December last year, so we are expecting a response soon. In summary, the consultation proposes 1. Introducing simpler annual benefit statements, which do not exceed 2 pages of key information, whether this be through a template or design principles, which will make them easier for members to read. 2. Standardising the assumptions used for the statutory money purchase illustrations, which is going to make it easier for members to understand and compare their options from different schemes. And 3. Including on the face of the annual benefit statement pound and pence information about costs and charges, so members know exactly what they're paying, so what's going into their pot and what's coming out of it. The consultation also raised suggestions around colour coding and information presented in graphics. At present, there's been very little voluntary uptake of the design, so making certain requirements compulsory is also being considered. We expect the industry reception to the consultation and its recommendations will be generally positive because it is helping members and employees. Given that pension schemes are all so different, guidelines to promote consistency for members would be very helpful. So we'll just have to watch this design space.
So when do you expect these changes? Have you got any sense of when these changes are likely to come in?
We're waiting for the response to the consultation.
And sometime after that then?
Yes.
And speaking as someone to whom pensions is pretty much a closed book, and that's why I come and find people like you to ask my silly questions, is this something that people see will genuinely help people understand pensions, which is, let's be honest, quite a complex subject at the best of times?
That's exactly the intention. The idea is, at the moment, annual benefit statements can run 10, 15, 20 pages depending on the scheme. The idea is you can have all the key information in 2 pages, and it's going to be upfront what is relevant to the member,
right, so
that they can try and understand it a bit more, because that's exactly the point. People get a bit foggy when they see pensions. It's like maths at school.
Yes.
You think I don't understand it, but actually you do. The information just needs to be presented in a more understandable way.
Not sure I ever wanted to understand maths at school. That's an entirely different subject. Okay, so my turn, and I wanted to start by talking about IR35. A bit of a theme from the things that I've chosen, which is that it's status of employees and the consequences of certain claims, which I think are hidden and may take employers and indeed trustees by surprise. But let's start with IR35. As most people will know, if you want to identify someone, you want to take someone on and you want to ensure they're not an employee as far as possible, the way people have done it for many years is that you get them set up a personal service company, or they come via an agency, and the agency employs the individual, the agency contracts with the customer, the notional employer, and because there's no contract between the notional employer and the individual, then there can't be a contract of employment, and therefore the individual can't be an employee. Well, for 20 years or more, we've had the IR35 legislation, which in essence says, if you assume hypothetically that in that particular relationship there was no personal service company, would the individual, when they are contracting directly with the customer, employer, would they be treated as an employee? And so you make this sort of hypothetical finding based on a hypothetical contract. And if the answer is they would be an employee, then for tax purposes only, they are treated and taxed as if they are an employee. But it's extremely important to emphasise, they're not treated as an employee for things like employment rights. So, as I've seen someone sourly commenting online, they're getting taxed as an employee, but none of the upside for an employee in terms of statutory or indeed common law rights. Well, why am I mentioning this if it's been around for 20 years? Well, from the 6th of April this year, for medium and large organisations, the risk associated with IR35 is changing dramatically. The customer, the end user, will be responsible for identifying individuals who would hypothetically be employees, and it's then the customer that has to deduct the tax, and the customer is the one who will have to answer to HMRC if there is a failure to deduct tax and HMRC says that IR35 applied. So we think this is going to provoke quite a lot of reviewing of contractor arrangements, and the reason I think it's relevant for this podcast, we know of organisations that are saying, right, we're going to have no personal service companies, we're going to put people directly on the payroll, so they become employees, and obviously rights and so on then flow from that. That may trigger rights to pension arrangements. But the other thing that we've seen is vast amounts of confusion with people worrying about people who are direct contractors with no personal service company, where of course IR35 doesn't apply at all. So I think a lot of companies are looking at their contractor rights and their use of contractors and deciding whether to keep them as contractors and then whether to tax them under IR35. And that comes in, as I say, from the 6th of April.
And so you said that you've got these notional employees, but technically they're not employees. So for automatic enrolment purposes, has this considered the impact for that and whether...
Not as far as I'm aware, to be honest, because if they're not employees, if they're only being taxed as employees, I don't think they get any rights as employees. They just get the burden of being employees. And of course, where this typically will play through is employers' national insurance, which, as I understand, you could sidestep quite neatly by having a personal service company and then paying yourself out by dividends. So I think in that sense it is a revenue generating thing rather than transforming people and giving them new rights that they didn't have beforehand.
But if you do actually want to move away from this personal service and make them employees, then that is going to push them into the automatic regime, which is then going to improve the amount of money people are saving and hopefully retirement incomes.
Yes. And we've seen reports that a number of banks have said, right, that's it, we're not using personal service companies, full stop. I think it's fair to say most of our clients are still going to use personal service companies, but they will need to do the assessment as to whether or not IR35 applies, and then tax in line with that.
Thank you.
Okay, all right, your turn.
So keeping on the theme of improving the pensions experience for members, it's expected that there will be guidance issued on the implementation of pension dashboards in 2020. So the idea of a pensions dashboard is that it will be a single digital view where every member can clearly see in one place online all their pension savings. By allowing members to log on to one portal to see all their pension savings, it's expected that the member will have a better understanding of what benefits they have, and this will improve understanding, which in itself will increase engagement. And it will encourage members to save more and seek financial advice, which will improve member outcomes in retirement. The concept of pension dashboards were first introduced back in the 2016 budget, and since then there's been a lot of close cross-industry collaboration to bring the dashboard to life and to address the practicalities of sharing the necessary personal data and collecting it all in one place. There's a new protocol which has been demonstrated to the government, so it's expected that more details will be able to be shared with the industry during 2020. But obviously, as you would expect, pension schemes have information, as do employers, so it's going to have to be everybody working together to produce this one pensions dashboard to make it easier for members to see all of their benefits in one place.
So it's a very similar thing about empowering individuals so they know what they've got or how much they haven't saved, and are able to make sensible provision for the future.
That's exactly it. If you can see it all in one place, because it's very hard if you move jobs, you've got different pension schemes for different employers. People sometimes forget they weren't somewhere very long, and also just seeing it all in one place makes you realise what you've actually got all together.
Yes, and would that apply with people with spouses' pensions and things as well? So that if you were qualifying by virtue of your partner having earned a pension.
So I think that would still, at the moment, we've not seen what they're going to put out there, but I think that would just be on the members' dashboard, and then you might be told what your spouse's benefit is, because although a lot of people do get married and stay married for life, during your membership it can change. So you wouldn't put a spouse's benefit on somebody that a member's married to,
right? Because
they might not be married at the point of death.
Gosh. Okay. Cheery thought.
You're
all fun. So I'm going to talk about Uber, and this is as I say, the theme is that status and the rights the rights individuals have may not be entirely apparent just from reading the contract. So. Uber, the well-known Lyft organisation, is a interesting creation. It purports to be a platform under which independent individuals, drivers, make their services available, and passengers can contract directly with drivers for the purpose of getting lifts. The issue is, in fact, whether, despite the very clear documentation that Uber has put in place to make it only a platform on which customers and drivers, passengers and drivers, can contract directly. The issue is whether, in fact, the drivers are workers for the purpose of being their statutory rights, which and then Uber then has to comply with those statutory rights. Uber, of course, is saying the individuals are independent, nothing to do with them, and it has no direct responsibilities to them, no statutory responsibilities to them. Uber claim that Uber drivers claimed that they were workers, and they won at the Employment Tribunal, they won at the EAT, and indeed they won at the Court of Appeal. And the gist of the Court of Appeal's decision is that the contractual documentation that Uber has put in place, very carefully recording its relationship with the drivers, doesn't actually reflect the reality of the relationship, and therefore the court is free to disregard that. The interest at the Court of Appeal stage is that the Employment Tribunal was frankly brutally against Uber's position. The EAT a bit more measured. Court of Appeal, it was a majority decision, and there's a very eloquent minority judgment that, in essence, and I am paraphrasing horribly when I say this, says just because you don't like the outcome doesn't mean the court gets the right to disregard contractual arrangements that have been put in place. It's due to go to the Supreme Court in July. We'll probably have the outcome sometime in the autumn. But the issue is, these individuals who on paper were clearly set up to have no statutory rights do have statutory rights according to the court's interpretation. And that may well have knock-on effects in terms of what rights they are given under a contract to receive benefits and so on, and indeed they will have certain statutory rights, national minimum wage, paid holiday, etc. And so hidden beneath the surface is this cadre of hidden workers, if I can put it in those terms, where if you just looked at the documentation you'd have gone, well, they're not workers and therefore they don't have any statutory rights, or they don't have rights to particular benefits and so on.
Can you give a bit more detail around why the written documentation didn't constitute the contract of employment?
Sure.
Because that can be relevant sometimes in the pensions world,
yes,
to a statutory transfer right.
Okay, so Uber had set up the documentation very carefully to say it was just a platform on which independent parties could contract. The court effectively found that that was not borne out by the realities of the situation. Uber had a significant degree of control over the drivers, and in the circumstances that combined, I remember, with certain stray comments made by members of Uber management about our drivers this and our drivers that and part of the Uber family meant that the tribunal could identify facts from which they could say this relationship is not the relationship it's portrayed in the contract, in the contractual documentation. The reality is these people are working for Uber and therefore they are workers, because there was clearly a duty of personal service. Deliveroo, which went through a similar claim, won its case because there was evident there was no duty of personal service. But in general terms, and boy is this a generalisation, if you have a duty of personal service, then it is much easier to show that there is a worker or an employment relationship, because the essence of an employment or worker relationship is I contract with you, Beth, to do a job for me, and if you can't give it off to someone else and have them do the job for you, then you're locked in and that looks like an employment arrangement. Whereas if you do have the right to go, that's great, Nick, and my cousin will turn up and do the job, then that's nothing like an employment arrangement, and therefore that would be a factor. So Deliveroo won, Uber so far has lost, but it'll be very interesting to see whether the Supreme Court says, yes, the tribunal was able to decide that, or whether the Supreme Court grasps the nettle and go, just because we don't like how they've structured it, if they have structured it that way, it's not our place to rewrite the arrangements that parties were freely contracting under. We will see. Okay, your turn.
I'm going to finish off by talking about the pension scheme bill, because the pensions piece would not be complete if we didn't talk about that. It's still very much on everybody's minds. We talked about it previously in our 5th pensions episode, which came out in November last year, but there's obviously been some delay given the general election. The committee stage in Parliament is now scheduled to begin on the 24th of February. So as a quick refresher, the bill covers 1, a framework for collective defined contribution schemes, which this will allow savers to pool their money into a single fund and share the investment and longevity risks. 2, pension dashboards, which we've covered. 3, new powers and sanctions for the pensions regulator, including broader inspection and information gathering powers and various new criminal offences, such as the avoidance of the employer debt and conduct risking accrued scheme benefits. 4, the change to the notifiable events regime, and there is also the employer's notifiable events regime. There's going to be a new requirement for employers to notify the regulator and submit a statement about certain events affecting a defined benefit scheme employer. And 5, changes to long-term funding and investment requirements. And then finally, changes to the statutory transfer restrictions. It will be interesting to see how the pensions regulator intends to use its powers and how its clearer, quicker and tougher approach is implemented in this context, particularly whether it will lead to increased engagement with not only trustees but also employers sponsoring pension schemes.
So the notifiable events regime, is there a regime at all to that effect at the moment, and is it being strengthened? Is that the idea?
Yes, there's a regime at the moment. There are notifiable events that trustees have to tell the regulator about, for example, large transfers, and there's also a regime that employers need to tell the regulator about.
Right.
Here, what they're looking at, they're trying to, at the moment, you can go for a clearance application if certain criteria is met and there's any chance, for example, that a pension scheme will have a detrimental impact because of something the employer is doing. But the bar's quite high, so what they're talking about here is a statement of intent. So if the employer is talking about doing something, by putting together a statement of intent, the idea being if you have to put it down on paper, you're going to think about it a bit more.
Yes, and presumably in extreme cases, if you have to notify the regulator before it happens,
yes,
then the regulator might go, we've got all sorts of red flags here, we're going to intervene or do something about it.
Yes, that's always open, because that's coupled with the fact that the regulator is going to have more powers.
Right.
So, for example, the criminal sanctions, if there is something that happens to put the accrued benefits at risk.
Right. Okay, fine. So my last one was going to be Asda Stores and Brearley, which is the equal pay case, which I think is groundbreaking in a whole number of ways and is very definitely an ongoing case. Background, of course, is that equal pay has been part of the law in the UK since 1975, and broadly speaking, if you want to bring a claim for equal pay, you find someone of the opposite sex and you say either I'm doing the same work as them, like work, it's work that's been rated as the same in a job evaluation scheme, or it is work effectively of equivalent value. And the Asda Stores case is groundbreaking because up until now there have been lots and lots of cases in the public sector, but private sector claims have been rarer than hen's teeth. And we're now seeing that change, and there are a number of supermarkets facing claims, and to that extent the Asda is at the front of the queue, and the way it goes is going to determine the implications for the private sector, large-scale private sector employers, with workforce where everyone isn't necessarily on the same terms and conditions. So let me explain that point. Asda's got 630 retail stores, it's got 24 distribution depots, and it is asserted, has not yet been determined, that the distribution depots, which tend to have predominantly male employees working at them, are paid better and receive better benefits than the retail stores, which are disproportionately have female employees. And as I say, that's all still to be determined. What we've been through is whether or not a comparison is allowed to be made. The Court of Appeal has said yes, it is possible for the women in the retail stores to compare themselves with men in the distribution depots. It is not a defence that men working in the retail stores are paid the same as women working in the retail stores. If men in the distribution depot are paid differently, then a comparison can be made because there are common terms. And what the Employment Tribunal, looking at this initially, seems to have thought is that if you were going to establish whether someone in a retail store was on common terms with someone in a distribution depot, you looked at whether the terms were similar between retail and distribution. And the Court of Appeal has clarified that's not the right way of looking at it. What you would be saying is that if someone works in a retail store, then if they were located at a distribution depot, would their terms of employment be the same as the ones they actually enjoyed? In other words, is the reason that they are employed, the terms they enjoy, because they are at a retail store or just where they happen to be located? So here, because there was no doubt that retail employees, if they'd been housed at a distribution depot, would still be on retail terms, it meant it was possible for the retail and distribution depots for an equal value claim to exist between the two. And the policy reason underlying that, frankly, is otherwise it would be very easy for an employer to underpay jobs that were typically, let's say, associated with women by making sure that you didn't have jobs that are typically associated with men housed in the same establishment. And if you don't have that sort of cross-establishment comparison, that would then be a significant gap. The Court of Appeal, just for good measure, also said that because there was a single source setting the pay for both retail and distribution, i.e. the Asda board, in those circumstances a comparison was permissible as well by that route. So the case will go forward. We will see whether it goes up to the Supreme Court. We will, and then the hard work will start, which is actually doing the comparisons between women in the retail stores and men in the distribution depots to see whether it's work of equal value. And if it is work of equal value, then the question will be, is there a defence to that says, even though it's work of equal value, there is a genuine material factor that justifies the differential? So, yes, a long way to go. The sums involved in it are astronomical because there are lots and lots and lots of employees covered by this. So it'll be fascinating to see where it goes, and then what this means for other employers who are likewise potentially going to face equal pay claims too.
Do you think this will create a precedent though, or do you think it'll be too fact specific?
I think it's clearing a lot of precedents out of the way so that the potential for the claim is now going to be much clearer. And once there's a potential for the claim, then I think there will be more claims. I think the big unknown, of course, is how you deal with market forces in a private sector environment where that may, in commercial terms, justify what the distribution rate is from what the retail rate is. But whether the court will accept that is legally the justification, well, that's a very different question. But there are a number of cases. We hear that a number of supermarkets where cases are stayed at the moment as this goes through the various stages. And once you knock down all the arguments about, well, can a comparison be made, then it becomes, it's much easier to see that claims will arise, and claimant lawyers will be all over it. So we will see. We will see. But this is definitely going to come back again. So, good. So that's the business end of the podcast. Now, as people who've listened to the employment podcast will know, I always tend to ask with a personal question about books, films, movies, whatever, piece of music. And Beth, I think you opted for the movie round, the film round. So come on, film recommendation and why?
So my favourite movie would be The Blind Side.
Ooh, I don't know anything about that. Come on.
It's actually about a famous football player. I think his name's Michael Orr, but I'm not into football, so that's not why I like it.
You're selling it well so far.
What it is for me, it's how a single act of kindness can change someone's life for the better. So it's about a famous football player, but this family takes him in, and then he becomes very good at football, and because he's supported and he's got that network. So I think it's a very nice, feel-good movie about.
Is that who's in that? Is that Sandra Bullock?
Sandra Bullock.
I remember.
And actually, she looks so different.
Oh, right.
She's a southern belle with blonde hair. She looks completely different. Very good, isn't it?
Okay. Well, in that case, you might like my one then, because I've just discovered The Good Place, which is amazing. Yes. All right. So I'm behind. I'm racing through this and I just discovered The Good Place podcast. Listen to our podcast, one per episode. We're plugging other people's podcasts, don't tell Mayor Brown. But it's really good, really fascinating. So, I'd recommend that. But, yes, I'm late to the party on that.
The big question, though, do you think we are in the good place? Or the bad place?
Working at Mayor Brown, there is only one answer to that. Yeah, I hope no one in management listens to the podcast. All right, well, anyway, thank you very much, everyone, for listening. That's actually been good fun, as you can hear. And hope you found that useful. And Beth, your podcast goes out, what's the sort of relative frequency for it, and how do people subscribe to it?
The podcasts go out monthly, and they are on the iTunes channel as well as YouTube.
Good stuff. And the employment podcast goes out fortnightly. That's why I've done more of my podcasts than Beth has of hers. And it's, as I say, in all the usual places. And I think, as is traditional for closing at podcast time, it just remains for me to confirm that no pension lawyers were harmed or mistreated in the making of this podcast in any way. Thanks very much.
So that concludes this podcast. We hope that you find it and others in the series helpful. If you have any comments or questions, or want to know how to claim continuing education credits, please email Nick at nrobertson@mayorbrown.com. Thank you for listening to the podcast.